A big thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this week's video. If you need a website or a domain, go to squarespace.com/James for 10% off your first purchase. So this is Arthur. He's 3 weeks old. You wouldn't know it, but he's got a set of lungs on him, which he likes to exercise most in the middle of the night, which is nice. He smells amazing though. I was saying to Emily the other day, if you're a parent, I don't know if you've had this, but I feel like a lion mother. I felt like this with Noah as well, but basically I just want to lick him clean. Is that a weird thing to share? Probably. Who cares? It's been nearly 4 years since Noah was born, and truth be told, I forgot how tiring it is having a newborn baby. So I don't feel like I'm firing on all cylinders at the moment, if I'm being completely honest, and therefore I thought today, rather than go out and try and take photos and end up asleep on a rock, what I could do is try to combine all the biggest stuff that I've learned about photography over the years into one video. This is all stuff that I've spoken about before, largely at length in other videos, but I thought if I get it all into one video, then hopefully this video will become a useful, quick resource for some of you at least. That's the plan. And then I'm going to go for a nap. Definitely. So thing number one I want to talk about involves gear. And this video won't be exclusively about gear. In fact, it's mostly not about gear. But every single day I get asked, James, what camera should I buy? And that's a very difficult question to answer unless I know everything about you and your photography. And also, to be honest, I'm not the best person to answer that question because I don't know the camera market all that well. But there is something I can say about buying gear, and it stems from a conversation, a drunken conversation I had outside a pub in London on a sunny Friday evening about 12 or 13 years ago when I was talking to a bloke I'd never met before in my life. And we were talking about life. That's the good thing about pubs. Those weird conversations. Anyway, we were talking about how to decide how much to spend on our hobbies. Can't remember why. Probably because of the beer. And I was telling him I was into photography and therefore cameras, and he didn't share what he was into. Maybe it was weird. But he was saying that his rule for deciding how much to spend or what to spend money on was that he didn't buy anything he wasn't willing to pay double for. The thinking being quite obviously that that would stop frivolous spending on stuff that you don't really want. You have to really, really want something to be willing to spend double on it, even if you're not actually spending double on it. And at the time I remember thinking that was a bit weird, but actually as time has gone on, I've started to think that that's very, very good advice for camera equipment in particular. And the reason for that, I would say, is having spent time with hundreds of workshop participants, having spoken to thousands of people, my biggest bugbear is people buying very expensive cameras and then essentially using them as paperweights. Lots of people don't want to take their very expensive camera, for understandable reasons, to the less shiny parts of town. They don't want to take them out at night, they don't really want to take their camera within 2 miles of seawater, and they don't want to take their camera out in the rain. And I get it, cameras are expensive, you want to look after them. And I'm not advocating for throwing cameras up against a wall or dunking them in the ocean. But cameras, unless they're taking photos, or these days video I suppose, they are useless. All they can do is capture light. And if you're not using them for that to their fullest extent, there's not a whole lot of point to them. My knees are drenched. And so, like I say, I understand people being careful with cameras, but not to a point where it costs you opportunities to learn or opportunities to actually get the photos they're intended to take. And so, when you're shopping for cameras or lenses, asking yourself, would I be willing or able, or both, to spend double on this thing, should ensure that when you get it, you won't feel overly precious about it. And some of you at the moment are probably thinking that's unnecessary. Insurance exists. But I think insurance premiums are, in many cases, from what I've seen, ridiculous. And also over the years, I've spoken to too many people who've said that their insurance company found a way to wriggle out of paying out for claims. I just don't like the idea of paying insurance companies. And what I would advocate for actually is taking that money that you would pay to an insurer, keeping it, investing it, saving it yourself, and over time, essentially become your own insurer. Now that's not right for everybody, but that's what I advise most of the time. But yeah, my one and only universal piece of advice for when you're buying a camera is make sure you don't overspend on it to the point where you're so worried about breaking it that you never actually use it for what it's intended for. Last thing about gear, everything is a compromise. Take sensor size, for instance. It's easy to believe that the bigger the sensor, the better. That's not true in lots of ways. And if you get a medium format camera like this Fuji GFX, often the lenses are going to be very expensive, they're going to be massive, files are going to be huge, which has implications for your storage, for instance, and depth of field is even narrower than a full frame sensor. Now that can be a good thing, but it can also be a very frustrating thing. For instance, I have to make sure that I'm shooting at much narrower apertures than I typically do when I'm using this camera, and that's fine when you've got lots of light, not so good when you haven't. So photography, and especially gear within photography, is all about compromise, regardless of what it is that you have. Another thing that I get asked about a lot is photography style and how people can acquire a photography style. When Emily was pregnant with Noah, 4 years ago-ish, she bought me a watch, which was very nice, and one of my thoughts when she bought me that watch was, oh, this is brilliant. I can give this to Noah when I'm no longer around. Anyway, when she was pregnant with Arthur, this time around, I thought, well, I'm going to need to buy a watch, aren't I? Because Arthur's got to have a watch as well. And watches are, I've found, a brilliant way of buying something you can say is for your kids, but really it's just something that you want. Let me know in the comments if there's anything else like that that I'm missing. Anyway, through the shopping process of this watch, I convinced myself for 3 or 4 weeks that what I really wanted was a vintage watch, preferably made in the year of my birth. I love old stuff that looks like it's had a life, imperfect, scratched, dented. I love all that. But it struck me after sort of 3 or 4 weeks of thinking about this that there are 2 ways to end up with a watch that looks like it's been worn for 30 odd years. You can either buy a watch that's 30 odd years old, or you can buy a new watch and wear it for 30 odd years. Quite obvious really, but when I thought about it, and I thought about myself in my 70s, sat looking at my watch, what I really want is to see lots of scratches and dents and dings, but to know that they're mine and that they are from my own life. And you're thinking I've lost my thread, but I haven't, I promise. I think photography style is much like vintage watches in that way. You know, it's pretty easy to import a style from somebody else. If you watch how somebody else works, if you watch where they shoot, the kind of light that they shoot in, the gear that they use to shoot, if you buy their presets, for instance, it's pretty easy to come up with basically what other people are shooting. But really, I think a much more organic, meaningful, joyful way to come up with a photography style is to let it happen naturally over time. And I think the ideal scenario is to not necessarily be able to point to a specific source of inspiration when talking about your style. So I think, for instance, when I think about how I shoot, what I shoot, how I edit, I couldn't really tell you what has inspired me to shoot like that. And it's not because nothing has inspired me, it's just because it's been thousands and thousands of things over time. Blog posts, other photographers, movies, documentaries, places that I've been. Loads and loads of stuff has influenced what it is that I do. And also, photography style is not really a destination, I don't think. It's a journey, it's constantly evolving. And so yeah, basically that's a very long way of saying that I think the best way to come up with a photography style is time. Which in many ways is probably quite an unsatisfactory answer, but I think it's the truth. Next thing, context without distraction is my goal for all of my photography. And if you're just starting out in photography, I think every time you arrive at a scene to photograph, you'll be well served by asking yourself the question, how can I simplify this scene? So yeah, I like to think about photography as a process of elimination rather than a process of addition. You're trying to remove things from a scene to simplify a scene more than you're trying to add things into a scene. And on top of that, I'm hoping to provide more questions than answers with my photos. Really what I want people to be thinking when they're looking at my work is, who lives there? What was that building used for? What the hell's that? Because in my experience, it's questions that keeps people coming back to look at photos, not necessarily that they just look nice. Another thing that I get asked about a lot is photography as a career. And it's another thing that I find difficult to provide answers on because the industry is very fluid and it's evolving all the time. Not that long ago, if you wanted to take photos for a living, you needed to be a wedding photographer, an editorial photographer, a commercial photographer. There was quite a small number of ways that you could earn a living with a camera. Now, it's endless. And I consider myself incredibly lucky because I don't even need to take photos for anybody else. No clients, nothing like that. I can just take the photos that I want to take, and that's my job, and I love it. But when it comes to answering questions like, should I go to college for photography? I feel all at sea, really, in providing an answer, because I think it's so dependent on circumstance and the area that you want to go into and how important things like contacts are going to be in that area. It's very difficult to provide an answer. What I can say, though, that I think works as career advice and advice if you're just a hobbyist photographer, is that I think more often than not, it's better to aim for different than better. In other words, I think lots of people aim to be 1 or 2% better than the competition. I think you'd be better served trying to be 10% different than the competition. And so basically, rather than trying to get one rung further up a ladder other people are on, create your own ladder. And so yeah, if you notice ways that you're different or ways that your preferences are different, lean into them. Next thing, take your camera with you everywhere. This is something that I'm terrible at. But the reality is it's all well and good thinking you know what constitutes beautiful light. It's easy to think you know ahead of time if there's going to be an opportunity for a photo or not. But all I can say is that with my personal experience, a big percentage of my portfolio occurred without me knowing it was going to occur. I got a photo of whatever it was purely because I had my camera, not because I'd planned to be there with my camera. And there has been a lot of hype about everyday cameras for the past couple of years. To some extent, I get it, particularly if you're the sort of person who walks around normally with a big heavy zoom and a massive DSLR. There is something to be said for something that's a bit more pocketable and that you're willing to take everywhere because you don't know where photos are going to unfold. Next up, learn to enjoy the process, not just the result. One of the things that photography has taught me about life is just how little we control. And you'll know this if you've looked at the weather forecast thinking, oh, that's perfect conditions for the kind of photo I want, I'll go out, only to find that the forecast and the actual weather are different. You might have also had times where you've jumped out the car only to miss the fisherman casting his net or whatever it might be by 2 seconds. In any case, every single minute that we are alive, we're missing photo opportunities, amazing portfolio-worthy photo opportunities. And the faster we realise that, the faster we learn to enjoy the process, not just the result, because the results are fleeting and out of our control a lot of the time. The process is what should be the fun bit. A couple more gear-related things to finish off. I lied earlier. I do need to talk about gear again. Try as much as you can to worry about the camera less and worry about the scene more. Again, this is something I've picked up from workshops, but often you'll see people messing around with a camera trying to dial in the perfect exposure, or wondering whether they should be at f8 or f9, or trying to find ways to get their ISO lower. Should it be the 24-70? Should I get the 70-200 out? There's lots of faffing with equipment going on, and all the while, the scene is unfolding in front of them, to the point where they'd have been better off just getting their phone out and recording the whole thing on their phone, because then at least they'd have captured what was happening, instead of thinking, oh, 200th of a second or 250th of a second. And I am part of a community that's really guilty of encouraging this, because we have titles on YouTube like, nail the perfect exposure, don't focus like this, why you should always be at 100 ISO. Photography is this weird mix of art and science, and science, the exposure triangle, how to deal with a camera, that is infinitely easier to teach. And as a result, we neglect the art a lot of the time. We think less about the art, more about the science. But the art, I think, is the exciting bit. Penultimate point, try and think about how visible you want your camera to be in the process. Now that might sound like a bit of a weird thing to say, but I realised some time ago that I didn't want my camera to have that big a footprint on my photos. By which I mean I wanted to shoot at a height that resembled head height. I wanted to shoot with a focal length that resembled how we see the world. I didn't want to use things like shallow depth of field or very dark ND filters that would make my photos different to how I see the world. And that ended up really heavily informing the gear that I was shooting with. Now for you it might be the opposite. You might love ND filters. You might love shooting at 600mm. But whatever it is, I think it's important and helpful to be intentional with this stuff. And thinking about this ultimately can help you to reduce the amount of kit that you're carrying. And that will never be a bad thing in my eyes. And last but not least, something I spoke about quite recently, find a project. Photography can be really, really difficult. But if you've got a project in mind and therefore a criteria of what it is that you're looking for out of your photos, it becomes easier, so much easier to work out what it is that you're looking for because you have a destination. And that destination doesn't have to be a book or a calendar or something published. It can be a social media post or a set of 4 prints on your wall. But having something to aim for, I think, makes everything significantly simpler. And as I said earlier in the video, simplicity is what we're after. Anyway, I think that's all the points. This photo that I've got in the background on my screen at the moment, I've been busy working on it today because I'm printing it at the moment. My print store is back up and running. There are a handful of prints available in my print store, but in truth, every image that you've ever seen from me probably is available as a print. And I really don't want my print store to end up as just an endless stream of images to choose from. And so if you're interested in buying one of my photos as a print, there's now a form on a page on my website, I've linked it in the description, where you can basically start a chat with me and we can work out what would work for you. Obviously, most prints end up on the walls of people's houses and therefore they're incredibly important to get right in terms of sizing, the image itself. So I do think it's quite a personal process, and I think that ultimately is probably the best way to go about things going forward. So yes, get in touch if you're interested in a print of any of the work you've ever seen on this channel or on my social media or my website or whatever. Speaking of my website, a giant thank you to the sponsor of this week's video, Squarespace. So Squarespace is where I host my portfolio, my online store. I'll write a blog post occasionally. I'll send a newsletter out when I've not just had a baby, and it's where I track the analytics for all of those things. It's integral to my business. I've used it for the past 7 or 8 years, and I've done so without ever knowing a single line of code. And I think having a website is a fantastic tool for all photographers to showcase our work regardless of whether you do it for your living, and I'd highly recommend checking it out. If you want to check Squarespace out, just go to squarespace.com to start a free trial, and after that, if you'd like to make a purchase, just go to squarespace.com/James to get 10% off your first purchase. And a big thank you to them for their continued support of this channel, and a big thank you to you for watching. I'm going to go for that nap. Yeah.